Thomas Bachheimer was a stock trader and for over 10 years appeared as a guest analyst for TV stations such as CNBC, Bloomberg, Reuters, and Al Jazeera. He is a declared opponent of what he sees as the unfair fiat money system, which only serves the politicians who maintain this fiat money system. Mr. Bachheimer is chief economist of GVS and is the European president of the Gold Standard Institute. He has been residing in the UAE since last year. I am now connected with Mr. Bachheimer and I will start right away with the first question. For over a year, Mr. Bachheimer, the war in Ukraine has been raging. So, for a year now, there has also been an economic war of the West against Russia. And, as is well known, these sanctions were imposed to bring Russia to its knees and stop the war. In the Western media, it is often pretended that Russia is isolated and that alliances and organizations such as the BRICS countries or the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, are meaningless. What is actually going on behind the scenes of world politics, or rather the global economy? Well, we will only really find out what is going on much later. But in the meantime you can analyze and observe the processes and the events closely. We need to go back a bit. Putin has for more than 2 decades reached out to the West. For 2 decades, Putin actually wanted to get his raw materials together with the West and use them for the good of all. That is, for the good of Russia, as well as for the good of Europe. Some people had something against it, and the consequence was of course NATO's eastward expansion, and then, when he felt isolated, Mr. Putin then made a decision that was probably very difficult for him, because he knew that as soon as he invaded Ukraine,
ihm wahrscheinlich sehr schwer gefallen ist, denn wusste, sobald einmarschiert in der Ukraine,
all of his plans of coexisting with the Western countries can be forgotten, and that he must choose the second option, namely his connection with the Chinese. These were certainly informed in advance, and one has seen in the BRICS states, which were previously organized more like a tennis club. But immediately after the beginning of the war of aggression, the BRICS states began meeting much more often, making more far-reaching decisions. They are resource-rich states: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And in addition, there are more or less covert requests from Saudi Arabia, from Iran, from Argentina, Qatar, Mexico, and Venezuela. So the commodity states are forming a counterweight to the West that we have since the post-war period. This can also be observed in the diplomatic actions between the Arab region, China, and Russia. These groundbreaking changes will be the biggest the world has seen since 1945.
Das wird wirklich bahnbrechend werden und die größte Veränderung seit 1945.
The result will be that 5 billion people living in resource-rich areas, which are developing at a very fast pace, versus 1 billion people who live in gender and rainbow flag-waving Western community of values. It will be relatively exciting to see what the next years have in store. Mr. Bachheimer, let us please come back to the sanctions against Russia, which are indisputably damaging our economy. But to what extent do they actually harm the Russian economy, and to what extent do they harm the Russian financial and banking sector in particular, starting with the Russian Central Bank? Well, the Central Bank of Russia, of course, suffered a lot of damage. But that's what you have in Russia. But also, China knew in advance that a sanction would of course be unleashed here, and appropriate preparations have been made. Of course, restrictions on access to foreign exchange reserves. The central bank's ability to stabilize the ruble was significantly compromised, but the Russians repelled this well. We all know that the Russians have been building up massive gold holdings for 10 years, and of course that always serves to secure a currency. And in April 2020 they said, "We have now prepared our gold holdings sufficiently, we stop buying gold as a central bank."
Genügend vorbereitet. Wir hören auf, als Zentralbank Gold zu kaufen.
Strangely enough, a year and a half later, half a year before the start of the war, the central bank once again bought massive amounts of gold. So you could really see that something was being planned, because it was publicly announced that we wouldn't buy gold, and then all of a sudden they got another boost of gold. So they have prepared themselves well. The second, of course, was the formation of alliances, which we mentioned at the beginning. This was probably already agreed in advance, because something like that doesn't go so smoothly within a few months, and in this respect the Russians were able to fend it off halfway. We saw that the Russian ruble fell massively at the beginning of the sanctions, but it recovered relatively quickly. It became even stronger than before the war began, and we are now oscillating between mild strength and pre-war levels. So it hasn't bothered the Russian ruble that much so far. In general, for the economy, of course, the sanctions were, one can say, also catastrophic, because it was limited access to foreign financial markets. The companies could no longer refinance themselves in this way. The sanctions have zeroed out certain business activities with certain goods and services, temporarily, until the formation of alliances has taken place and, of course, foreign investors, which a commodity state like Russia needs. Investors, but also technology, have suffered considerably. Just think of various spare parts that the Russians need and that cannot be obtained in China either. So there are already considerable disadvantages, but in my opinion they have been well prepared, especially from the central bank side. Mr. Bachheimer, during your last interview with the AUF1 News, which was in December, we had you connected from Dubai. How is the conflict between the West and Russia seen in the Arab world and in Asia in general? The Arab world has a special role. It is a bit divided between Iran, Persia and the Arab world, the classic Arab world as we know it. Of course, this region has been under the dominance of the USD dollar for years. They sold oil. Sometimes this was agreed or under pressure from the USA, and the transaction was always settled in dollars. An oil exporter like Saudi Arabia then receives government bonds for the goods it produces, i.e. oil. And these government bonds will no longer be printed on paper, but will be transmitted through computers. And, of course, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia then looked at what was happening to Russia. And when the Russian assets were frozen, he knew, of course, that this could happen to him at any time. There have always been tendencies towards de-dollarization in this space. The occasion was not given, but we remember, it has always been the case that the Saudis have already settled differently in some cases. Iran wanted to make an oil exchange that does not require US dollars and trades with China. That was then stopped again, that was in the noughties. It was already very dangerous for the US dollar. And this de-dollarization really took shape on the occasion of this invasion of Ukraine and became more concrete. And I would also like to point out the symbolism that I also experienced down there. You know, Xi Jinping was greeted in Riyadh with a saber dance. A saber dance is always reserved for the crowned heads. And so it was a special accolade for Xi Jinping and a special welcome. A few years earlier, another uncrowned head had been given the saber dance, and that was Donald Trump. And when you see within a few years, and you know that symbolism and sign language are very important in the Arab world, within a few years from the saber dance for the USA to the saber dance for China, that's a particularly exciting and telling story of what was to come. And that's when you know that a change of interest, or even a change of hands, is now underway. The locals in the Arab region, who are relatively surprised by the determination of Mohammed bin Salam's actions. But also Al Nahyan, who was also in Moscow, that is the head of state of the Emirates, they openly exchanged friendly words. And one sees that with joy when you know that you are in a fair currency system again, and that you can settle accounts differently. But sometimes also with a certain fear, because you don't know how the declining hegemon USA would react to this change of hands in the Arab world. Mr. Bachheimer, you have recently mentioned Iran several times. Recently, there has been increased anti-Iran sentiment, and Western mainstream media are acting as if the country is as isolated as North Korea, and regime change is only a matter of time. What is your perception in this regard? Is the mullah's regime perceived just as negatively in the Arab world as it is in Europe, or is it seen differently there? So I wouldn't dare to say negative perception now. But there are also, as in Europe, from the outside point of view, we are Europeans, all Europeans, but the British and the Greek think very differently. And it's the same in the Arab world. And above all, there has always been a polarization between Iran and Saudi Arabia. This was historically justified. It was about supremacy in the Muslim world, both scientific, economic, and religious. There were also two different religious currents. So the Shiites against the Sunnis. But there were also foreign policy reasons, which always portrayed the two countries as great adversaries. Saudi Arabia has had economic alliances, as we have discussed before, with the United States and with the West, while Iran has always been strongly opposed to the West. And that has really created a lot of antagonism between these two empires. And now, all of a sudden, as we know, 2 weeks ago there was a great peace pact, reciprocal embassy openings and, in some cases, trade agreements have been concluded. This was also confirmed by the locals I knew, and I was still in Arabia 2 weeks ago, of course. Already with a big surprise, because in advance you have not heard anything about it. And it was actually almost unthinkable before how close they are now officially to each other again in symbolic language. And the side effect is that an economic area has been created here that goes from the Arab world directly to East Asia. The Silk Road is secured and reopened by this pact. And it is hardly surprising for all of us if we then have to accept the additional sensational news that China has been working behind the scenes to ensure that Iran and Saudi Arabia understand each other. And this, in my opinion, is a geostrategic world sensation. That this great empire of China has interfered there, or has acted as a pacifier, which in turn speaks for the fact that the BRICS are very determined to take proper action against the West here and to deprive the West of its heroism. Let us go back to the dollar, please, Mr. Bachheimer. The economic power of the United States is based almost entirely on the reserve currency function of the dollar, which in turn is a result of the outcome of World War II. But how long do you think this will continue to be the case? Couldn't the rising world power China now see the time for breaking the dictates of the dollar together with Russia and others? Yes, this was actually already going on before the invasion, only rather covertly. China and Russia have repeatedly taken de-dollarization measures with bilateral trade agreements. But now they are obviously closing the bag. The timid attempts are over, and the BRICS countries will now, of course, completely de-dollarize and free themselves from Western financial hegemony. Indeed. What would be the practical consequences, Mr. Bachheimer, of the end of this dominance of the dollar for the world economy and, above all, for Europe and the euro? Yes, I just wanted to get there. We have to know that China has the largest accumulated dollar reserves worldwide. If China is now taking an anti-Western, anti-dollar course, and if Xi Jinping decides to press the sell button, you can't even imagine what that means. There will be an oversupply of US dollars, the price of the US dollar will go down. All the assets that we know in the Western world, government bonds, stocks, they are somehow connected to the US dollar interests and the Western hegemonic regime.
Wo die Aktien notieren, die sind ja alle irgendwie mit den USA, mit US-Dollar-Interessen verbunden.
Just imagine, the value of the dollar is now plummeting. An oversupply from China to the dollar, then, of course, the normal people who would accept the dollar or want to trade it will still withdraw from the market. The US dollar will be massively oversupplied, complemented by a declining interest in everyday usage and trade. This will shrink the dollar values in this world, and if they will shrink, then we will all have a problem, because all our pension accounts, life insurance, these are all tied up in government bonds from different Western countries. We will see that our savings will lose a certain value on an ad hoc basis and, of course, we will lose our purchasing power as a result. Our purchasing power will decline very sharply and each of us will be affected. And the really interesting thing about this situation is that it is up to one man or one Politburo to save the values of the West.
An einem Mann oder an einem Politbüro liegt, die angesparten Werte des Westens jetzt etwas schrumpfen zu lassen.
The problem that still exists is with intoleration. Russia's currency is no longer accepted internationally because it is being banned, but the Chinese also have a problem. After all, the Chinese currency is not designed to be a world monetary system. In India, although there are over 1 billion people and the #1 export nation, it plays only the 5th most important role in international trade. So there are always US dollars, euros, yen, British pounds in front of him, and he has only 2.2% of the international trade settlement volume behind it. And, of course, the renminbi has capital controls and is not taken seriously abroad. This is now forcing these BRICS states to form and create an honest and groundbreaking currency, probably commodity-based in order to have credibility in the West and to trade with the West again.
Wahrscheinlich rohstoffbasiert, die Glaubwürdigkeit im Westen zu haben, mit dem Westen wieder Handel zu treiben.
It's not like they don't want to sell us anything anymore, because they have to make a living somehow, but they need a billing system that is credible and which can work long-term. And I think massive work is now being done on this. Unfortunately, you hear very little about God and when this accounting system is finished. Whoever has the raw materials makes the rules, and the US dollar is then, or you may even say the hegemony and superiority of the US dollar is then probably history forever. It is very exciting and scary. Mr. Bachheimer, thank you very much for this detailed information. We are already looking forward to our next conversation.
Dankeschön für die Einladung.